Welcome to Retro Game Coders, where the goblins are attacking. In this video, we're going to look at how in a dungeon crawler game we can redefine the keys. We're going to look at enemies that move around, actual combat, and some weird memory issues that I ran into, and how I solved them so that you can avoid it in future. Let's take a look. First, redefining keys, and I need to mention why, and it's because somebody called me out saying that QA and OMP were difficult for them. Yeah, QAOP is not to everybody's taste. I could have changed it to WASD, but that's not to everybody's taste either. So offering the opportunity for people to redefine the keys is pretty cool. It's nice to do, and also it's another thing that allows me to show how to do it, the solution. And the main thing that you have to do is set the defaults. You have to say what the default configuration is going to be. In Commodore 64 BASIC, only the first two characters are actually significant. It ignores the rest. So it's important to make two character variable names that don't conflict with each other. So I went with A key, P key, etc. And then when you're checking for the player input, we need to check for the variables instead of checking for the literal. So instead of checking Q or W, we check for key variable instead. And that allows us to change the variable and then change the keys. That does mean that we need to have a redefining keys mode, a screen where we ask the user to press the keys that they want instead. And it has to be a key press, it can't be an input, because they might want to press a key that's not represented by your regular input. We put a little title on the screen. We say, press the key for up, grab the key. Press the key for down, grab that key. And we have to wait for the key press. So we do a little loop there that says, if nothing's been entered, keep looping around until something's entered. And then at the end, we say, are you good with these? Yes or no. And again, we have to do a loop if nothing's entered. And if they press yes, then we go back. If they say no, then we go to the start of the change key at the top of the screen, go through it all over again. So that allows people to use whatever keys they want. Next is enemy movement. If you recall, in the previous version of the game, enemies sat there and we could run into them and we could detect that they were an enemy, but there weren't any danger to you. You could completely avoid them. The most simple version of an enemy that's a threat is one that constantly tries to move towards you. And this isn't smart. It doesn't walk around walls. It doesn't avoid objects. All it does is it says, keep going closer and closer to the player until you hit something and you can't move. So what we do is in the game loop, we add an enemy logic routine. And that is where the enemies are going to move. Because it's a turn-based game, player goes first, then the enemy, and then we check to see if the game's over before looping back again. So we've just added an enemy logic subroutine, and the outcome of the enemy logic will determine if the game's over or not. We need to have a list of the enemies. Right now we just draw them on screen and we check to see if we've run into them. Now we actually need a list, and we need the number of enemies, we need the position of the enemies, and we need the health of the enemies. So the most basic part is to count up how many we add, and then we make a list of the X and Y positions of each one. And I've only got goblins right now, so I'm calling them the gobbo count and gobbo list. We need to modify the drawing routine for the meta tiles. When it's a goblin, we need to add the goblin to the list. So if it's meta tile 17, then we need to add the position of the goblin within that meta tile to the list. If you remember, the meta tiles are 3x3 grid, so we need to actually add from the top left, one across and one down. That's the position. So we've discovered we've added a goblin. So we add one to the goblin count, and we record its position. For the combat right now, we're doing a highly simplified version, but as you can see, we could get really complicated with it. The full Dungeons & Dragons takes into account the character's statistics. From the statistics, it determines modifiers. For example, if they're doing hand-to-hand or melee fighting, it uses the strength. If they're doing a ranged attack, such as arrows, it uses the dexterity. And if they're a spellcaster, it might use their intelligence. Other types of spells might use wisdom. And you roll a d20, add the modifiers, and see if you hit the other character. We're not doing all of that here because it's a lot of math, and right now we just want to get it working. We can always come back and add it later. So what we do is we do roll a d20. That'll give us a number between 1 and 20. And then we add the strength modifier because swords and hand-to-hand use strength. And then we compare it against a goblin, which I've said is an AC of 8. You can change that if you like. Now, if we miss, we lose 5 health points. Again, damage is usually a roll with other modifiers, but I'm just saying take away 5. And then for our damage against the enemy, we've got another random roll here. And then we say we hit the gobble with this much damage and we display that on screen. But adding all of these arrays made me have a really weird memory problem. And how it manifested was strange screen glitches and things missing on screen. It's hard to tell, but instead of saying use QAOP, it says USQOPKYS. I was scratching my head. On further investigation, my arrays had gone up into the redefined characters. What happens is BASIC grows upwards, and my character set was 4K. It was 2 full character sets, but I was only using the main 2K character set. I wasn't switching between uppercase and lowercase or anything like that. So by trimming it down to 2K, and by telling the Commodore 64 that BASIC finishes at that character set at 3800, I was able to free up 2K and keep my game growing. So that's why this version now has characters 8c.bin. It's 2K, and my BASIC now lives quite happily below the character set instead of overwriting it. To do this, we have to use the CLR command, but CLR clears all variables. So what we do is we poke into position 2, the number 73, do the CLR, and then when we come back, we can check if 73 is present and skip doing that the second time. That means we don't have an infinite loop. So coming up, now the gobos need to attack us and cause us damage. Right now, we could generate a map with 0 goblins, or we could generate a map with far too many goblins. It's not fair. We need fair gobo generation. We need those endgame conditions so that you can win or lose. We need more than just a goblin, so I can show not just being chased after, but different types of enemy patterns. It would be really cool if you didn't see the whole map at the same time, and that's traditionally called fog of war. There's other names for it, but fog of war is what I call it. And then we want levels and stairs navigation. We want to be able to move up and down into different rooms. So subscribe so you don't miss out. And you might want to watch the other videos in the series. Make sure that you've not missed anything important, you know what's happening, and all of this makes sense. See you in the next one.